Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program concludes our conversation with four members of our podcast team: production coordinator Jasmine Chizugota, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, editor Elizabeth Schwab, and former communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen. In this episode, Jasmine, Sabrina, Elizabeth, and Jessica discuss the advantages and challenges of developing and publishing podcasts, how the Human Rights Education Now podcast was received at a 2024 Human Rights Education Conference in London, the next stages of development for the podcast, including how podcasts can engage youth in the struggle for human rights, the most influential role models for their HRE work, quotes which have inspired their work in human rights education, and their recommendations for moving human rights education forward in the United States. So now let's shift a little bit to talk about the pros and cons of podcasting. It is a huge market in the world today. So what do you see as the advantages of the podcast medium and also perhaps the challenges or disadvantages? And I'm going to start with Elizabeth.
I think podcasts are a medium that have a lot of different steps in between them. So you have like coordinating interviews, setting up the actual interview, coming up with questions, which Bill has done a fantastic job also, to give him a quick shout out. And then there's the promotional side on platforms like social media. We, thanks to Sabrina, got it all figured out with Buzzsprout, but that was also an initial challenge and obstacle. And then just continuing to come up with new content as well. But for the pros, I personally think that the pros do outweigh the cons. I think podcasts have a really unique power in that they like humanize super complex like global issues and perhaps research or different journals and things like that. They invite young people or people of all ages into conversations that are sometimes left out of formal education. We all just talked about how we hadn't really been exposed to human rights before. I think podcasts present a really unique opportunity in that it can be accessed from anywhere and anyone can listen to it and hear some of the incredible individuals that we've had on our podcast. I think that that's one of the real powers of podcasting, is that classrooms might not always teach human rights, but podcasts can.
Yes, why don't you continue?
Yeah, Elizabeth, that was well said. And I was just nodding in total agreement. Like it's this, I know when we were, we had a fellow who was doing kind of like data crunching of how far the podcast had spread and who was listening to it where. It was so cool to see that, like, I think there was someone, in Pakistan or something that was listening. I mean, it was like going far and wide. And that was just so cool, the reach that a podcast can have. Like you can really access that absolutely anywhere and get this information. So I concur with you on that. And then I think a downside to the podcast is that it's really a downside to any platform nowadays. And I think podcasts are just in there with the mix of all of these mediums that are available, is that it's too much. There's a saturation of media options. Like, the amount of podcasts you could listen to are just, it's everywhere. The amount of shows you could watch or films or documentaries or, it just goes on and on. So we're just living this moment of saturation with media, which, while it's such an accessible platform, it has to somehow still find its way through all of that media to somebody, which I think is the challenge. Like, because people have so many options when they flick on, these gazillion devices we all have to get to that one podcast. But, you got to put it out there or nobody can get to it.
Jasmine, how about yourself? What do you see as the pros and the cons?
I think I will agree with everything that Elizabeth said about, the pros and the disadvantages, advantages. The podcast is a huge amount of work. I'm always very impressed with this team and what we've been able to accomplish. And it is a lot of work. But I do think I also agree, like the advantages are that it's open source. You don't need to be in a specialized class. You don't need to first get accepted to a program or university to be able to hear from human rights educators who work in the field and get their ideas and insights. So I feel like the advantages are just like it really serves like there's an educational function that it has that it kind of opens the field up a little bit. And I think it's a lot of work, but I feel like it's paid off.
Okay, Sabrina, what's your viewpoint on this?
I definitely second and third what Elizabeth and Jessica and Jasmine said. I think sustainability, yes, has always been top of mind for us because we have a lot of other professional and personal demands outside of this group. So sustainability is an internal hurdle and ongoing kind of discussion. Saturation, my gosh, is definitely up there. And with that, I'll add that the challenge for us, which could also be seen as an opportunity, is to find our niche and to find our niche again, and then to refine the niche again, because everything is moving at rapid speed. And there are ways for us to be creative. I don't have the answers, but I know there are ways for us to be creative to continue to sustain our audience while also keeping it fresh and new and intriguing and dynamic. And so I always wonder, like, what is our niche going to be? Like, could that help us sustain and keep us engaged? Is like figuring out like what next, that could really inspire and keep us excited. And then, sure, like not to like be redundant, but on the flip side of saturation is just all of this information that could be misconstrued as misinformation or disinformation. And then with maybe the tightening of access to human rights information, we could potentially be flagged. I was flagged with my previous organization, and then we were unable to post on a couple of social media platforms. So then I think about accessibility being a massive challenge too, like more politically and technologically given the current administration. So that's something that I think we need to continue to keep our finger on the pulse, figure out how to proactively respond to that.
Well, you've all raised very important points, I think, about not only the internal challenges, but the external ones. And this last one that you just brought up, Sabrina, I think is quite important, and that is a question of whether censorship will be imposed through direct or indirect means. So I think that's an important discussion we have to have. In fact, I know we're coming up to another podcast meeting, which is another dimension of what we do. We have a monthly meeting on Zoom, and so we talk about the things we do and how do we want to advance it. So a bunch of you went to London to present at a conference. And I'd be very interested for our audience to hear what you felt the message was you received about the podcast there and what you were trying to tell the audiences there about what we do. So, Sabrina, why don't you start, and then we'll go to Elizabeth and Jess, and then Jasmine.
London was a wonderful experience. I think one for the bonding and the camaraderie and the rapport building, because I had never met anyone in person on this call. So I was able to meet Christy and Jess and Elizabeth, and Bill and Jasmine, you were missed. But that was a huge piece too. And I think that kind of ignited and reignited some of our momentum. I think our work was really well received and people seemed genuinely interested in it. There was a lot of academics in that space, more like publications. And so I think sometimes we have to fight for podcasts being legitimate as a formal, tool, education tool. But people were really responsive. They were intrigued by our work and honestly impressed by our numbers. We had a lovely poster. Thank you, Jasmine. It was a team effort, but Jasmine really carried a lot of that, most of it. And so I think the numbers was a really sense of achievement for us as a team, but also kind of it caught people's eyes. And we had it kind of helped with it helped with exposure. It helped with exposure. We were able to interview some of the people who attended. And we really increased our downloads after that. So I think again that like mutual reciprocity building was definitely at play. Um, and yeah, I think that we can continue to have more of these conferences, that are suitable and that are aligned with our work, and if we have the capacity to be able to attend in person, because I think, yeah, it was a really wonderful opportunity. So I'll hand it over to anyone else.
Yeah, I will second that. For me, getting to meet everyone in person was a wonderful experience, alongside everything that I learned at the conference. Sitting in on the different presentations and hearing the other types of research that individuals were doing there, for me, was also really huge, like getting more exposure into the human rights education field in general. I also agree. I think the response was very positive. The poster definitely helped. And I think also for us, just seeing the reach that the podcast had gotten was super motivating and super positive. I think it's over like 60 countries now. And I would also say one of the highlights was getting to meet people who listen to the podcast and getting their feedback. For me as an editor, asking if anything could be improved, or like if things with the sound, everything really. So it was a wonderful experience. I second what Sabrina said.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Elizabeth and Sabrina have pretty much said it, but I just also want to go back to the origins of that conference even occurring, which all is thanks to Jasmine, really, because, she and I got on a call and I was like, hey, there's this conference. Like, what do you think like we could do? And it was Jasmine's idea to actually put the podcast forward as a project to present at the conference. And so it is all thanks to Jasmine that we ended up even going, even though she couldn't be there with us. But yeah, it was her great proposal and wonderful idea. And it was a big success to take Jasmine's, yeah, see, there's a leftover artifact, to take that's Sabrina's QR code, which was so cool to take there on our cards, and Jasmine's poster and all the, yeah, of course, getting to be with everybody in person, huge highlight, because again, like everybody here, we were always working so closely on Zoom all the time, but never had gotten together face to face. So that was massively fun. And then, yeah, getting to talk to all the other people, actually getting to watch all the other kind of conferences and just be there with other folks who share your same values and ideas. And that was so incredible anytime you get to go to a conference like that. So it was definitely a great experience.
So Jasmine, now you're going to tell us how you came up with the idea.
So, yeah, I remember getting the email from Jess asking about, hey, do you think we could try to propose something to go to this conference? And I remember the first thing I said was, I know that I can't make it to the conference, but I'd be more than happy to help with setting something up. And as we were kind of brainstorming, I'm thinking like there's, from a data perspective, because you're talking about presenting an educational project, there's this podcast we have that has all of its data very well organized. And there's so many interviews. And because I'm in the middle of the organizing what my dissertation may look like place, I'm looking at all these interviews and thinking there's so much here that would make an amazing article, which I will also throw out there, has been turned into a book chapter in a forthcoming human rights education book. Yeah, it was just like this idea of presenting something from Human Rights Educators USA and realizing how much has actually already been done, how many of the members have been talked to. Like it's a really good representation of like the best that the organization has and the network's built. And I'm just really happy that everyone was on board with that idea. I really am sorry I missed everybody in London because it sounds like it was amazing. But I'm so happy that it worked out.
And I want to reinforce the team effort here, because nothing gets done on this project without a team. And I think it's very important that people hear that. It's been that way from the beginning, and it's going to have to continue that way, because nobody here has all the information, all the skills And when you build a team like this, which I think we've done rather well, you have to understand that there are always going to be obstacles. And we've worked together to try to overcome them. Which leads me to, where are we going? And so my question now is, for anyone who'd like to begin, what do you see as the path forward? What are some of the things you'd like to see happen with this podcast going forward? Because in March of 2025, we will publish our 50th episode.
We could have a party. We could have a podcast party. I think in an ideal world, we will continue to publish episodes on a monthly basis, and we have a couple of new potential team members who are playing a more active role. So I definitely see some new faces joining, and that can and will always bring some new flair and some new ideas and some new support. We've talked about doing video. We're on video right now, but again, capacity, time, and kind of just like the state of the world at the moment, like we've got to slowly get to there. But I see maybe having some videos in the future, releasing some videos. And then also, like one key piece is the role of youth. And we always want to increase youth involvement. And we are actively working on that. So I'm not going to release any details unless someone else wants to say something. But, we are continuing and actively seeking more youth involvement to host, to be a part of the team on the back end, the ones to be interviewed. So yeah, I'd like to continue to keep this podcast alive, and will contribute as much as I can moving forward.
As Sabrina just said, I think youth engagement is going to be a huge area for the podcast, or I hope it is. We've been working on expanding our outreach to youth audiences more. So we just started an Instagram for the podcast, which is really exciting to reach wider audiences. And as Sabrina mentioned before, we're also thinking about ways to incorporate youth in like the back end with editing. Being on a college campus, I know that it was an incredible opportunity given to me, and I'd love to relay that to others. But also including them in interviews, roundtable discussions, including youth more.
I think that wherever the podcast is going, it's going to be exceptional, because there are so many great minds working on it, and especially bringing in new voices and young people. That's going to, as Sabrina said, energize it with new ideas, things that this team hadn't thought of yet, and maybe could not think of, until you bring someone new on there and let them kind of generate some of their thinking. But maybe the video thing, I know that was like thrown around a lot, which would be cool if that, came to fruition, where it was now also something accessible on YouTube and had another way that you could reach people. But I don't know, it's going to be exciting to watch or listen or maybe watch.
I like all of the ideas so far, and I think I'll probably throw in with the idea of maybe incorporating video. As much as I would be terrified to find out this is the first video, I do think it'd be a good idea. I was also thinking about the possibility of like maybe looking at ways to incorporate some lesson plans from the podcast, because we have so many interviews and we have so many different people with different backgrounds, and as it expands and we start getting new voices and ideas, it would be really interesting to see, like, we have a lot of, we're just a network of educators, so it would be interesting to look at maybe what would it look like to start building some lesson plans around the podcast.
Those are great ideas. And another dimension of this that we didn't actually do, but is now happening, whether we like it or not, is that on Apple Podcasts, these are being transcribed by artificial intelligence. And when we began the podcast, there was no artificial intelligence tool. But I think we've always had sort of a problematic relationship with transcripts and publishing them, because whereas artificial intelligence does it by machine, we would have to actually ask people to review every transcript to do it ethically. So I think that's another aspect we want to talk about, and potentially publish them in other languages as well, which is something that would take a lot of labor-intensive work, but I think could have a big return, you might say, down the road. Well, we're going to move on to our last few questions here. These are the same questions that I ask every interviewee, so you're not going to be exempted from this. And I'm going to start with Jessica. Who is the most influential role model for your work in human rights education? Now, alive, or in the past, no longer with us?
I really had a hard time nailing one person down. And again, I'm just going to draw on my primary background here, which is literature. And to me, literature and human rights, they really just go hand in hand. Like I think some of the first places I was getting introduced to human rights, and I didn't even really know to call it that, was actually in my undergrad lit courses. So like reading things like, George Orwell, reading Margaret Atwood, reading Elie Wiesel, and, reading Harper Lee. And like you're reading all of these texts that they are actually at the core of them getting at these ideas, right? They're getting at human rights ideas. Like great literature really kind of like unpacks all of that for you and puts it in front of your face. And so for me, I don't know, I just kind of am lumping in all these great authors as my human rights role models, because I feel like all the ones I just said, and then of course you could just keep going on and those stories really stick out in my mind, and those people really stick out in my mind, those authors, as like giving me the foundation of understanding, what human rights was before I even had the term human rights. So I would say it's a whole host of those literary giants that live in my mind as great role models.
Okay, Jasmine, how would you answer that question?
I think the most influential role model, and yeah, I also struggled with this question just to narrow it down, for my human rights education work specifically, is probably Dr. Monisha Bajaj. She's been my advisor, she was my advisor in my master's program, and she's still my advisor in my current program. So I think, yeah, I'm gonna name her.
Okay, Sabrina.
Yeah, hardest question of the interview by far. I'm gonna say as a mentor and as a young adult, is the founder and executive director of the other human rights organization that I've mentioned already twice, Human Rights Connected. Her name is Nicola Barak Yousefi, and she has really been just a guiding light and fearless leader. And also, I have been involved in a lot and in interested in peace building and civil resistance and nonviolent action. And so, yeah, that has also been just a really incredible building block to sustaining, I think, and enlightening my interest in human rights.
Okay, Elizabeth, how about you?
I also agree. This was a very hard question, but I think that for me, it goes back to that original human rights class that I was in. I read Climate Justice by Mary Robinson. And since then, I've written a lot of different papers on her whenever I have the choice to choose a topic. I think that her leadership, both as serving as the first female president of Ireland, but also her work in the rights of the most vulnerable around the world, has always really inspired me and been a guiding light on how to lead in the world with like justice and compassion. But also I think that her work reminds me that human rights education and human rights has to evolve to meet the most urgent issues of our time, or it can't just be stuck in history classes or seen as something that's in the past or a past issue. And for me, that's kind of continued throughout my human rights journey.
Well, I'm going to stick with you, Elizabeth, for the next question. What quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights or human rights education?
I would say the quote that I chose is by Desmond Tutu, and it's, "My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together." For me, that quote really embodies what the essence of human rights is. It's the idea that justice isn't an isolated idea, but it's about like shared responsibility and shared humanity. The moment we allow like discrimination, oppression, suffering to persist with one person or one challenge, we like slowly dismantle the shared humanity we all have together. And I think that that interconnectedness and being intertwined with everyone around you, no matter who they are, where they come from, is something that is really important for human rights, and for my journey too within it.
Sabrina, how about yourself?
I have to keep it short and sweet and shout out to Dolores Huerta for her Si Se Puede, because she always got sidelined. And I think especially in this moment of like extreme fragility and fear, we really need to band together as much as we possibly can. So,
And Jasmine?
These last three questions were like the hardest ones. The moment that I knew that I had to come up with a quote, even though I have a folder of quotes, completely blank. But Elizabeth reminded me of another Desmond Tutu quote that I actually refer to, not the kind of off kilter one I picked earlier. It is, forgiving is not forgetting. It's actually remembering and not using your right to hit back. It's a second chance for a new beginning. And the remembering part is particularly important, especially if you don't want to repeat what happened.
Okay, I'm going to go with this also, yeah, really difficult. I didn't do so well in the first question either. I couldn't pick one person. So I'm going to try and narrow it to one quote here. I had like 17, but I'm going to give you one. So I'm just going to go with, I think this one I like the most, but it's classically Mahatma Gandhi. And the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. And I really think that this gets at kind of we live in such a construct of world that forces us to be so selfish most of the time and look out for ourselves and be self-centered. And, we have to look out for, ourselves and our little family and get what we need. And but really like the true nature of what it means for all of us to be human is to kind of live with each other in that service for each other. And so I think we need a little more of that, and everything would go a little bit better in the right direction.
And last but not least, if I gave you the power to make one change to advance human rights education in this country, what would it be? And we'll start with Elizabeth.
This is also a hard question, but I think that if I did have the power to change anything, I would say that every middle school student read the UDHR just once. I think that for me, that catapulted my interest in human rights and my understanding of it beyond just what I had learned in service and the values that I had grown up with. So I would say just reading it once.
Yasmin, how about you?
One change. Okay, I think one critical change I would make is focusing on making human rights education interdisciplinary. That's partially because I have an interdisciplinary background, but where it is integrated beyond the silos and categories that we have in education. So you have multiple ways of understanding it. So it'd be like the breakdown of those societal silos that keep our work separate, because rather like this podcast team, like we are going to work better together.
And Jessica?
Yeah, it's very similar. I mean, I guess it's not a surprise because this is human rights education, but it's education oriented like Elizabeth, like Jasmine, but I just would really want to see general, like enforced quality education universally for everyone, because I actually do believe that at the core of human rights improving is an educated, society and an educated humanity. And so I think you just lose a lot when there are so many folks who don't have access to even education that isn't human rights oriented. I think giving people access to that high quality education and getting it to people globally, where so many swaths of people still don't have it, that does so much to kind of raise the bar of awareness and people's ability to even, kind of pay attention to any of that human rights stuff to begin with, like that you bring up the literacy rates and you bring up people's ability to kind of cognate better. And then I actually think that blanketly would do a lot of good.
Okay, Sabrina, you have the final word.
We need to continue to uplift grassroots education. I think sometimes human rights education in the US, again, can be pretty bureaucratic and limiting and too rigid. And a lot of the work that is stemming from these people-powered movements on the ground are oftentimes not in those spaces that deserve the recognition, and they might not want the recognition, but I do think that in order for HRE in the US to continue to be legitimized, we have to continue to pay our respects and honor all of the hard work that has brought us here today.
It has been such a pleasure working with you for the last 2 years on this podcast, because I can say as a personal note that I've learned a huge amount about not only what it means to create a podcast, but how to communicate effectively in ways that I never did before. So I think it's really a wonderful example, I think, of what a human rights education organization can do. And hopefully we'll continue doing it and making it better. So I want to thank all of you for being with us. And I hope that we will be continuing to make our podcast even better as we go forward. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hins, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.